Welcome back to the Beyond Phenomenal podcast. My name is Bryce Bicknell, and here's episode 3. There's been a lot of balloon talk this week. I don't want to cover it too much. You might have already heard about the Chinese spy balloon that they shot down. There's been kind of wall-to-wall media coverage about it. I'll just take a little caveat here. This podcast is attempting to bring down the UFO subject to a more palatable level where you get all the news and none of the hype and the drama that I think has plagued this kind of field for far too long. And so that said, I'll touch on one little part that there's a developing story about other objects being tracked in Alaska and Canada that people kind of are associating with these balloons, with one apparently being shot down by the U.S. There's not much to say about it right now other than the statements from John Kirby, who's at with the White House. And he said that it's an unknown object. Specifically, they're not sure whether it's a public or a private or a state-owned thing. And another official who said it was the size of a small car. I think it was hovering around, or hovering maybe is even too much of a word to say, but 40,000 feet. So nothing else definitive has really come out about it other than some statements, I think loosely talking about maybe it was silver or cylindrical, but nothing of substance really yet. That I'm hoping we'll hear more about it, and maybe it'll be really interesting, or maybe, could just be another balloon that personally I don't think we want to spend much time talking about. So on to this first topic. A prolific researcher named John Greenwald Jr. Runs a website called the Black Vault, and he specializes in FOIA releases. That's Freedom of Information Act releases. And these are documents and other information that can be requested about classified or previously classified information to get it out to the public. And this week we learned two interesting things from his releases. We learned that Lou Elizondo's Inspector General complaint was closed, but his security clearances remain intact, and he continues his work as a consultant for the Space Force, likely among other things that he does. Specifically, if you're curious about what he's doing, there's a bit more information in the documents themselves. There's kind of an interview for the complaint. And then also, we learned about the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, who looked into the release of the 3 famous UAP videos. These are the ones that came out with the New York Times articles and stuff back in 2017, the Go Fast, the Gimbal, the FLIR 1 videos. They're pretty interesting. You probably have already seen them. But if not, give them a good look, and also get some context about how they're shot, because it's using infrared and other stuff that it's important to know how the technology works. But people have been kind of curious about, well, how did these videos come out, and what's Lou Elizondo's role really been? Because there's been some confusion regarding his position. We had Susan Go, who was a spokesperson, I think, for the DoD, the Department of Defense, who said initially that, Lou Elizondo wasn't involved in this stuff. And I think that was part of the impetus for Lou Elizondo's Inspector General complaint. Among other things, there's this guy, Gary Reed, who is the Director of Defense Intelligence for Counterintelligence, law enforcement and security, and he had been, I guess, conducting himself unprofessionally. I won't get into that, but there's a link to a Politico article about it in the description if you want to check it out. But Lou Elizondo, among these other things that kind of obfuscated his role as the director of ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, he wanted to set the record straight, and I think the complaint was part of that. But it's now closed, and I guess it is a good sign, because if it was a fake complaint, his security clearances probably would have been revoked. It goes to show that things have kind of smoothed out, and beyond a shadow of a doubt now, it's been proved that Lou Elizondo was a part of this broader kind of OSAP ATIP. We'll talk a little bit more about that later with this other article we have for this week. But he was involved in that scene, and that he was directing this work at ATIP. And the case was also closed for the Air Force Office of Special oh man, I can't speak. I guess it's just AFOSI. They investigated these 3 videos, and they determined, yes, these videos were unclassified, and it's still a little opaque as to how exactly they were released. And it seems like it definitely wasn't illegal or unethical. They just had used kind of a different channel, and I think that might have raised some alarms. And ultimately, I think someone complained about it, potentially Gary Reed or someone else that Elizondo had run into issues with. And this is because this goes to the broader claim from Elizondo that his work was being undermined by people within the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. I believe that's where Gary Reed was positioned. So it's interesting to see this stuff come out. I recommend you check it out yourself. But yes, it's just good to further kind of a nail in the coffin of anyone who says, well, Elizondo isn't legitimate or is kind of doing this shady stuff. Well, it's been investigated and his name's been cleared and he still has his clearances. So there are some more questions that we could ask regarding kind of his, role and what he knows. I know I asked an interesting question to someone on Twitter about Elizondo's potential connections to remote viewing stuff. I know that's kind of totally tangential, but it's one of those things that I'm curious about personally, because remote viewing and UFOs or UAPs, they seem to have this interesting connection, and maybe we'll elaborate that in future episodes. But that was kind of those FOIA releases from the Black Vault, and now I'll get into a second segment. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, there's an excellent investigative journalist named Ross Coulthart who's from Australia. And he found in his research for his book In Plain Sight some interesting documents from a government official from Australia, and who's also kind of a researcher, I believe, at some of the, atomic testing grounds. His name was Harry Turner. And recently, Project Unity kind of did a highlight on this report that he had written, Harry Turner, from the Australian National Archive. And it was using official military, government, and intelligence reports and statements to compile a historical overview of what the U.S. government kind of knows about UFOs and their investigations and kind of the historical narrative. There were some fantastic details that extensively looked at various decisions by the CIA, the U.S. Air Force, and notable parts included Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. Those are kind of the main three projects that shaped a lot of the early history. And the first two basically concluded that the phenomenon was real. But later on, Project Blue Book kind of became this public relations, almost debunking arm of the UFO subject. And UFOs had become a problem for the military during the Cold War, the U.S. military. And so they were worried that, the USSR was going to use, psychological or communication warfare, under the guise of UFOs. Maybe there's an invasion or something. And so they used ridicule to kind of quell fear in the public about UFOs. And the report concludes with Harry Turner saying that Australia shouldn't remain ignorant of the nature of UFOs and the government should investigate them for scientific value. It's kind of interesting to hear this because this is coming out, God, I want to say it was 50 years ago. We're hearing the same things today that we heard 50 years ago. It can be kind of frustrating when you look at the evolution of this subject, because it's like, wow, yeah, I mean, what are our senators and members of the House of Representatives, what are they saying? They're saying, well, we don't know, we need to investigate it, and we've ignored this for so long. I really recommend this. I barely touched this. This video is probably, I think it's about a 50-minute video, and it goes deep into, things like the Condon Report and how it didn't necessarily line up the conclusions within the Condon Report, which, for reference, was used as the conclusions were used to say, well, Project Blue Book, there's nothing to investigating UFOs really, nothing of value, so just close Project Blue Book. And that was kind of the end of the whole UFO investigation in the public for essentially until the New York Times article came out in 2017. So this is really critical to look at this piece, and I really recommend anyone go and do their due diligence on this, because it will pay dividends in terms of your understanding of what we know today. There's also, I'll touch on one other thing from it. I believe they talk about the CIA convened a panel that talked about like training and debunking. And this is kind of getting at what I was saying earlier about the scare of how UFOs could be used for psychological warfare by the Soviets. And they convened a panel of people that basically said, all right, we're going to kind of train the public to recognize, things in the sky, which is fair. It's all good tactics, but ultimately the implicit aim, and from what is gathered from people who were within Project Blue Book, was that, well, they weren't really interested in investigating it. They just wanted this issue to kind of go away. So The name is eluding me right now for that exhibit. I think it was the Robertson panel, actually. That's what it's called. So if you're looking for something to look up specifically, go do that. But really, I recommend checking out this video. It's fantastic. It can be a bit dry, just because it's like facts. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. Really important. And on to the next topic. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is an article that came out from the Liberation Times. It's written by Christopher Sharp on February 7th of 2023. This basically will summarize what the third podcast episode in the Weaponized series covered, and I just thought this would be a much more succinct way to get across what it was talking about. So the creator, I'll just read a segment of the article. The creator and former director of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, UAPTF, Jay Stratton, has given his first ever public interview with journalists George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. Stratton is the only person from the U.S. federal government to have worked on all of the modern UAP programs and is the most senior figure directly involved to have spoken out, having held a rank comparable to a 2-star admiral. Just as a side note, this is kind of what I'm talking about when I say like the modern UAP programs. So it's important to kind of contextualize it. And I'll keep going. Speaking to Knapp on his approach to the UAPTF, Stratton spoke about the importance of trust. This is him speaking, we're already 70 years behind the power curve for trust, right? Because everybody says the government's lying to us and that the whole Blue Book thing and the whole Roswell thing killed trust. Regarding his investigation approach, Stratton later added, I kept an open mind, a skeptic mind, whatever you want to call it, looking for something that can answer this and all the means that I had to chase that. But there were definitely some times where we couldn't really close the loop, and we realized that something needed to be done about it. So Stratton's story, which led to the eventual formation of the UAPTF, started in 2017, key date. Following his involvement with the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, OSAP, and the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, that's, keep in mind, Lou Elizondo was running that, or at least heading a lot of that stuff. Stratton told Knapp that he had no intention of returning to the UAP topic again. That was until the New York Times broke its story about the Pentagon's secretive UAP investigation following Lou Elizondo's resignation from the Department of Defense. And after the New York Times broke that story, which included accounts from the USS Nimitz Tic Tac UAP incident from 2004, Congress's interest was sparked and Stratton was asked by his boss at the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, to tackle the topic and lead engagement efforts with congressional committees. An entity which would later become the UAPTF was subsequently formed by Stratton in 2018, 2 years before the Department of Defense formally established it in August 2020. Jay Stratton was seen as the best person to work on the topic by ONI due to his previous experiences with other UAP programs and his background in identifying capabilities of other nations' military systems and validating potential threats. In January 2021, when that year's U.S. National Defense Authorization Act became law, the UAPTF was given the daunting task of creating a report for Congress in 6 months. Here's a little more context. So when that first UAP report came out that I talked about last podcast, this is the backstory behind that. So this is another critical piece that's interesting to look at. And I know that got a lot more coverage than the second one, just because, well, first of all, it was kind of a first of its kind in modern history, but the second one was also kind of lackluster. But there were some other interesting things, but I'll keep going with the quote. So, with a monumental effort needed with few resources available, the task force became further handicapped when Stratton was reassigned to other duties. That left the job of creating the report to 2 other members of the UAPTF, despite them both having other full-time jobs. Some have speculated that Stratton's reassignment was an attempt to sabotage the work and pending report. However, the 2 remaining members were committed to transparency with the American public on the UAP topic. They pulled together a massive briefing presentation Stratton had created and used it as a basis for the report eventually delivered to Congress. Providing some context on Stratton's importance to the UAP topic up to this day, George Knapp told Liberation Times, quote, Jay Stratton was the U.S. government's top UFO hunter. He conducted the first in-depth investigation of the Tic Tac case and is the only person in the entire government to work on all of the major UFO probes, including the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency's ambitious program OSAP, its successor ATIP, and then the UAP task force, which he created, organized, and directed before it was formally authorized by Congress. And I'm going to stop that quote just to give out another little interesting thing. Looking back at what we talked about earlier with Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, it's curious to see, how these programs can kind of evolve and morph into each other. And they all kind of, it's interesting just to see how that is connected, throughout time. I'll continue. Quote, the classified briefing he wrote, narrated, and presented to key audiences is a primary reason why the newest program, AARO, was created. That's the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. So, another program, once again, kind of shadowing, or not in the shadows, but just continuing on the legacy of these other programs. Quote, and unlike many of his former colleagues at the Department of Defense, Stratton believes the public has a right to know what's going on rather than the obfuscation, stonewalling, misleading statements, and strategic leaks to debunkers, all of which continue to muddy the UAP waters. Overall, I thought that was a fantastic article. There's more to it if you want to go check it out. I've linked it in the description. But yeah, I'll just, give a second for that to kind of sink in because, like I said, there's some historical ties in here and it gives a bit more context to what we're talking about consistently day to day. And now I want to put a spotlight once again on Jacques Vallee's Forbidden Science Volume 5. There have been some more interesting quotes pulled out of that book. I still don't have a copy of it myself, but these were pulled, I think, by Joe Murcia, who's UFO Joe on Twitter, and I'm going to cover a few different things. The first one kind of talks about Dr. Eric Davis, who we mentioned last time was the author of the Wilson Davis Notes. And there's a lot of evidence, and we'll keep talking about that he actually did write the notes, and that the meeting itself was, it seems very fantastic. There's another thread that I wanted to pull out from talking about Hal Puthoff and this strange meeting that he had, I think, in Washington, D.C. But let me get into the first kind of quote thread. All right. The entry is Las Vegas, Friday, 26 March 2004. Quote, the Fiesta Rancho Casino Hotel on Rancho Drive, period. Hal and I had taken early flights in order to meet at the airport before others arrived. Without preamble, he told me Eric's story. Eric was the person who interviewed Wilson in the EG&G parking lot. He contacted the Admiral about his project to restart a chapter of AFIO, Association of Former Intelligence Officers, in Las Vegas, and the topic drifted to ufology. Eric is now in touch with the vice chairman of the association, who is none other than former President George Bush Sr. They've spoken twice on the phone. The first phone call was initiated by Bush, who gave Eric some advice about AFIO and his future career. Eric told him about his interest in the Corso revelations, and he's referring here to Philip J. Corso. Could it be that Corso was mistaken in dealing with the material he was handling? Could that have been Nazi hardware? Eric asked. Impossible, replied Bush. The two topics were clearly separated. By that time, 1947, all German secrets had been processed and filed away. They were not used as cover for anything else. Bush remembered General Trudeau. He showed interest in pursuing the discussion, asking Eric for his recent physics papers. He knew of the remote viewing project, but didn't recall Hal's name. He's referring to Hal Puthoff. The second conversation was more interesting because it got into the Holloman film, which remains a fixation for Hal, Eric, and me. The former president was aware of it. Was it a training film, a special ops exercise? No, he replied. It was, quote, the real thing. There was a secret project and the security was obscene. Eric developed other sources, notably a former DIA senior officer who confirmed that the DIA had a UFO collection program at one time. He promised to provide more information but died before they could meet again. Here's another caveat. An interesting thing is that this happens often, I think, because of the secrecy where people will get older in their years and want to share some of these secrets that they have before they die, but often, unfortunately, they pass away before we can get some more context. I think Chris Mellon had a similar encounter with that within, I think, the last year of someone who was going to come talk to him about it, and he passed away. But anyway, I'll continue with the quote. So, before they could meet again, his secretary found an envelope inside his desk sealed and addressed to Eric. It contained the man's notes about the project and the real source of the fake MJ-12 papers, with which the field of ufology remains fascinated. The story I was told is this. In 1961, the UFO project inside the government was taken over by DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. By the early 1980s, Rear Admiral E.A. Burkhalter Jr., who was Chief of Staff and Acting Assistant Vice Director in the Directorate for Collection Management, and his deputy, Colonel Roy K. Jonkers, U.S. Air Force, were in charge of the project. Man, that was a bunch of people. They are shown in these positions on an org chart dated March 1981. The same document shows Dr. Jacques Verona as Assistant Vice Director for Scientific and Technical Intelligence. Burkhalter, calling himself Mr. X, and a man named Polko, introduced as Falcon, decided to spread disinformation about UFOs. Apparently, Dale Graff, who monitored Hal's project on behalf of the DIA, wasn't in the know. The remake of the Sandler Emmenegger documentary in which I participated was The Convenient Platform, with the Norton episode, but when Pentagon PR man Colonel Coleman told us to, quote, go out on a limb to draw sensational revelations, I fortunately convinced Hynek we shouldn't take the bait. After I derailed this first attempt to turn us into useful idiots, Rear Admiral Burkhalter and Polko contacted Bill Moore and Linda Howe and reportedly spread their revelations through a frequently used disinformation channel. By then, the MJ-12 documents had been repurposed as genuine false documents based on data that came from the Oid Eagleton's disinformation files at CIA, and ufologists the world over swallowed the bait. So everything now ties together. I still fail to see the ultimate point of such shenanigans, however. And I just took a pause there because, wow, that's a lot of names again and some crazy connections, really. It's the MJ-12 documents, if you don't know, are some famous documents that they're controversial and they're less reliable. They've been documented to have some weird discrepancies, and if everything in there is just patently false, it's some of the most in-depth, fake documents ever made. A lot of people think that it's been kind of like coerced and manipulated to look real based on some real things, and then they, water it down and do classic disinformation strategies to really make it unclear about what's even going on. But I just think there's such an interesting quote from Jacques Vallee, because he's just such a stand-up guy in the ufology field, talking about this guy Burkhalter, who's Mr. X, and how the DIA took over the UFO project, and how this kind of turned into like a pet project to spread disinformation. I recommend reading the quote again. It's probably hard to digest it all verbally, but I'll get into the second quote too. Now, this quote is kind of weird. It's dated Tuesday, the 6th of December, 2005, in San Mateo, Euro-America offices. Quote, "The weather has turned cold. It froze overnight in Austin. Eric Davis kindly drove me back to the airport for the flight to SFO. I told him I thought he and Hal were grasping at straws, like all of us, seeking validation in an artificial vacuum. Hal was recently part of a panel assembled in Washington under semi-official to discuss the potential impact of publicly revealing the reality of UFOs. Attendees were broken up into 64 societal sectors and 8 subcommittees. Initially open to disclosure, all members ended up recommending secrecy because violent reactions to disclosure would be uncontrollable. Religious zealots would go on a rampage, clamoring for witch hunts. Hal doesn't know who organized the workshop or why. As for Kit," talking about Kit Green here and Hal Puthoff, they're just two separate people. Kit Green was, I think, a CIA scientist, and Hal Puthoff ran the remote viewing programs for the Stanford Research Institute back in the 70s. As for Kit, he now believes the alien autopsy, that's in quotes, to be genuine, a rare operation on a human subspecies specimen, not an alien, but not a progeria patient either. Upon landing, I called Hal again to thank him and ask about the workshops. They involved John Peterson, but they, quote, went much higher. The participants were told that the US, Russia, and China all had custody of alien hardware. For now, this is Jacques Vallee speaking, I hold to my working hypothesis that the psychological warfare boys are playing games, as they've done consistently since at least 1952. Of course, both assertions could be true at the same time. What a weird thing. Personally, when I read this, I kind of ignored the whole alien autopsy thing. I don't know, just because I haven't heard enough about it, but I thought the interesting thing was more so Hal Puthoff talking about a panel assembled in Washington, kind of a semi-official, organized. It's kind of unclear from the quote. It just seems like maybe someone who used to be connected with the military or something. I don't know. But being broken up into societal sectors and then seeing what was going on. It's interesting to see that Jacques Vallee thinks that, it could be psychological warfare. It could be people, genuinely trying to figure this out. But there's far more questions that this journal entry begs than it answers. So I thought I would highlight that too, because you never know. I mean, these people, this is something that if you got the chance to ask them about it, oh my God, I would love to. Just to say like, hey, do you have any more info on this? Like, did something change? What was, undoubtedly in the next, 15 years or whatever since that, over 15 years since that happened, there's got to be more information that probably came out about what was going on. So that brings me to the big picture part of this episode, which I'm going to talk about Ivy League colleges and the military-industrial complex and how they kind of relate to the structure of power and control on our society with the government. Malcolm Gladwell posted an interesting blog post about how Princeton is a perpetual motion machine. And in the context that he's using, he's describing their endowment. And the endowment is just the big chunk of money that's an investment portfolio that basically funds the university. And it's grown so large for many of these institutions in the Ivy League who they could just make their tuition free. The returns on their investment from their endowment is so high that they could make tuition free. They could pay for basically all of their operating expenses, and they would still be making money. And that's how it's like a perpetual motion machine. It's almost like a bank first and an educational institution second, which I thought was interesting. Like, this speaks to how our institutions are doing and who they're serving and their structure, right? It seems that there's a larger culture that kind of just uses money as a tool to control science and progress and innovation. And we've known, of course, about this through like the National Science Foundation and how research is done more broadly in sort of the cutting edge, because you need all of this investment in assets and specialized equipment and whatnot. But it feels like the cutting edge of science is already kind of on a need-to-know basis, because these Ivy League institutions are also the most, they're incredibly selective, right? You need to fit their exact criteria. A lot of the time, it's based on legacy. So if you have, parents and your parents and grandparents went there, you're more likely to get in. And there's almost a revolving door between Ivy League and like the CIA, the FBI. A lot of these powerful entities in the federal government also recruit, of course, from the best institutions. And so the connections that they form are kind of mutually beneficial, and they perpetuate an elitist sort of culture that I think is complementary to the military-industrial complex. I think that when you look at it from a high level, why would this ever be allowed to make sense? In what world does it make sense that a university is operating at such a scale that it's basically a bank, and one of the features it gives its clients is a high-level education? I don't know. To me, it rubs me the wrong way. And I know that everybody wants peace. Maybe you could say, well, Russia, particularly like Putin and stuff, but the general people, everyone wants peace. But this culture that is seemingly backwards just seems to dominate and work together with the financial institutions that we have, the military that we have, and how they relate to science and the industry that perpetuates, nuclear technology was, of course, an advancement that came out of science. But UFOs are just kind of the next frontier of this. And that's why I wanted to highlight it, because I think breaking the UFO story open is so crucial to stopping this strangeness that seems to keep us away from peace. It keeps us kind of locked in this, it's kind of like mutually assured destruction, but also like perpetual Cold War, where, we have the technology to destroy the whole planet, but we won't do it. Because it doesn't make sense, obviously. But at the same time, we're also going to keep innovating so we can find other ways to cut our competitors and, hurt our adversaries. And everyone knows that it's not healthy, right? So I think the UFO story could maybe pour cold water on this kind of hot fire of, well, these institutions have all this money and they can pay for the best research. They can get the best people. Those best people can then get into positions of power and reward this system. And I thought that was just an interesting thing, maybe to get your kind of thoughts provoked, or, just kind of stir the pot a little bit in terms of how we see our institutions. I'm not, entirely critical of our government and our education. Of course, I'm in college right now. There are a lot of great things, but it's so interesting to look at how it works at a high level. And I know Eisenhower was, I think, one of the first presidents to address this in his closing. I think it was the speech he was leaving off his presidency with. And he said, beware of the military-industrial complex. And it's changed a lot because that was many decades ago. Now we're seeing, the military is supported by the industrial players, and the industrial players are benefiting from advances in science, and science is funded by finance. So we have a military, industrial, financial, educational, boom, 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 this big old complex. And somewhere buried in there, the little kernel that could, sprout into real peace, something that really gets in the way of this harmful cycle, could, I think, be the UFO story. And, even if it doesn't, it's still fascinating, but I wanted to leave my thoughts on the table for this. So thanks for listening. I hope that was a little bit interesting and maybe got you riled up or thinking about something that you wouldn't normally think about. So hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next week.